build upon what Cara said. So welcome to this press conference here in Paris. It's a privilege to have you here with us, and it's a privilege for us to talk to you. Before I give the floor to our president, clearly I want to state that for the European automotive industry, the upcoming debate on further reducing CO2 emissions is a very important one. Our industry has done a lot. We intend to continue doing our bit. But of course, this cannot happen at the expense of the jobs within our sector, and it cannot happen at the expense of the competitiveness of our sector. And doing this presentation, doing this press conference here in France, where we have, of course, a lot of manufacturing, where the automotive industry is important, is also for us a way to make a point on the subject. So we are planning to have a very constructive approach on this big public policy debate, not only at national but at European level. And so in order to contribute to a balanced and informed debate on the subject, we as an industry have invested in a range of studies to just make sure that we bring facts and figures to the table, to ensure that we don't just talk in isolation, but take into account the realities in our sector. And it's in that perspective we want to present today to you the first study in a row which is focused on the impact of decarbonization regulation on the competitiveness of the automotive industry. So there are more studies to come, and we plan to keep you posted on what is coming. So, but for now, let me give the floor to our president, Ghosn, who will give you some overall perspective about our industry as well as on the subject of decarbonization of transport.
Thank you, Eric. Welcome. I will start with a few remarks, then you'll hear from the co-chairman of FTI Consulting on a study being released today. Afterwards, we will obviously take all your questions. Last year was a turning point for our industry with a total of 14.4 million new vehicles registered. It marked the first positive annual results since the financial crisis began in 2007. This growth has continued as we near the halfway point of 2015. This and many other facts are contained in the new edition of our automobile industry pocket guide, which we are launching today. Over the years, this publication has become a trusted source of industry data. The statistics show an industry that continues to provide employment and mobility, generate tax and trade revenue, and lead the world in terms of innovation. The Pocket Guide paints a picture of a changing automotive industry, one that is recovering from the shocks of the economic crisis. It shows an industry that employs 12.1 million people, directly or indirectly, more than 1 in 20 employed Europeans. It shows an industry whose workforce produces 17.2 million cars, vans, trucks, and buses a year. It's an industry that, together with its suppliers, is the EU #1 investor in R&D, with an annual spend of 41.5 billion euro. And it's an industry that is a global player and a major exporter, with a 95.1 billion euro trade surplus. This is compared with the total EU trade balance of 24.2 billion euro, highlighting the importance of autos to the EU overall trade position. But given the economic uncertainties still facing many countries, we cannot afford to become complacent. This is why it's now more important than ever to ensure that the competitiveness of our industry, one of Europe's most vital strategic sectors, remains high on the European and national policy agendas. If the European Commission wants to deliver on its pledge to boost jobs, growth and investment, this is the only way forward. Next week, the Commission is launching its consultation process on the future decarbonization of road transport. So today's publication of the FTI study on the potential effects of decarbonization on the competitiveness of the European automotive industry is timely. As the world gears up for the COP 21 Global Climate Change Conference in December in Paris, we must ensure that ambitious climate change policies do not conflict with the need to protect jobs and growth in Europe. The key is to find the right balance. We need to get the balance right between world regions. While being ambitious is positive, imposing overly ambitious targets for Europe risks creating competitive disadvantages for the EU industry in the global marketplace. We also must strike the right balance between industry sectors. No other sector has done as much as the auto sector to drive down CO2 emissions in recent years, both from its products and also from its manufacturing process. EU political leaders should ensure equivalent conditions and targets for all industrial sectors, taking actions where the greatest effects can be achieved at the lowest cost. Our industry has continued to deliver significant environmental improvement even when faced with flat or declining sales, and we will continue to do so through investments in more fuel-efficient technologies and also alternative powertrains. Yet, despite the impressive CO2 reduction that we have delivered for new vehicles, progress in reducing overall road transport emissions has been disappointing. This is why the automotive industry advocates a much more ambitious, comprehensive approach to tackling emissions. This means not only focusing on continuing to reduce emissions from the vehicle itself, but looking at the factors influencing emissions during the use of the vehicle. This includes the carbon content of fuels, driver behavior, infrastructure, and the potential of intelligent transport systems. To this end, ACEA has started to work in partnership with other stakeholders to examine the full potential of this comprehensive approach for light and heavy-duty vehicles. We will be reporting back on the results of this effort later on this year. We believe a balanced and comprehensive approach will make it possible to drive down road transport emissions further and faster, while at the same time protecting jobs and growth. We are committed to working constructively with the EU policymakers to make this a reality. I would like to close by saying some words on the issue of diesel. Modern diesel engines have been encouraged by regulators in Europe through various measures in recognition of their ability to further reduce CO2 emissions at a higher rate than gasoline engines. All manufacturers follow this encouragement by investing heavily in clean diesel technology, which today represents more than 1/3 of the car fleet in Europe and over a half of new car registrations. Diesel engines are a crucial part of the vehicle portfolio of every manufacturer to help meet the stringent CO2 reduction targets set by EU regulators. Any political signal that would now seek to remove diesel engines from the options to meet coming CO2 fleet average targets would damage manufacturers' ability to meet even the current targets. We share the desire to improve air quality, but doing so at the expense of pushing up CO2 emissions is not the right way forward. With a technology-neutral policy framework in place that encourages the more rapid adoption of the latest low-emission technologies, we can improve air quality and reduce CO2 emissions. Ladies and gentlemen, now it's my pleasure to introduce Chris Orban, who will present the new FTI study and further examine the link between competitiveness and decarbonization. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Ghosn. So I was reminded just now that not everybody will be familiar with my firm, FTI. So if it won't try your patience too long, I will give you a very short introduction. We are a firm that's listed on the New York Stock Exchange with an enterprise value of about $2 billion. About a quarter of our people are in Europe, most of them are in London. We have a mix of analytical skills. We tend to get involved in legal and regulatory issues where the need for thorough investigation and careful evaluation and clear communication is at its highest. This, I think, is one such area. We were asked to do some desktop research into the costs and consequences of the regulation of the automotive sector in relation to carbon emission. I'm going to outline a couple of the findings. There is a short brochure like this, which provides a summary. I believe it either is or will be available to you. That document contains a link to the full report, where the full report can be downloaded. I would encourage you to do that. So, the EU, as you'll know, has important targets in relation to the reductions in carbon emissions. Those reductions should be up to 80% by 2050, depending on exactly which parameters, which tests are being set. There are two primary mechanisms that are intended to drive these reductions. One is the emission trading scheme, the ETS, which applies primarily to the energy and the heavy industry sectors. The other relates to the road transport sector, and it works through progressive reductions in the allowed level of emissions on new cars. These mechanisms are quite different. And in some ways, it would be remarkable if both of them delivered similar results with similar levels of cost. One way of making the comparison is shown in the table on the right. It's the annual rate of improvement required of the different sectors. Within the ETS sectors, the rate of improvement required across the period 2005 to 2020 is about 21%, measured here in terms of the reduction in the volume of emission permits. Within the automotive sector, the improvement that's required, mandated, across the same period is 39%, much higher. Here measured in terms of reductions in the standardized level of emissions per kilometre for new cars and vans. The principle, and this is a principle built into the design of the emission trading scheme, is that decarbonisation should happen first where it's most cost effective. The cost of abatement within the automotive sector, however, is much higher, generally reckoned to be much higher. There are a series of McKinsey studies referred to within the full document that deal with exactly that point. And those costs are borne to a much greater extent than is the case in the ETS sectors within the companies themselves. It's worth noting here that the mechanism applies to new cars. You may hear this a lot, and on the basis of a standardized driving test. And that means that mechanisms that could be applied to older cars, or mechanisms that would serve to change driving behaviors, either of which would have a positive effect on the overall level of emissions, those mechanisms are not taken into account. This is the environment within which the automotive industry is currently operating. The effect can be seen in part in the chart on the left. And much of what has happened since 2007 is, of course, the consequence of the recession that happened at that time. But it's nevertheless worth noting because that is the environment in which the considerations as to new emission targets will be made. In 2007, the automotive sector in the EU was a world leader in terms of sales, as shown on the slide, but also in terms of production volumes, and also in terms of associated profits. That's no longer the case. And the data on each of those points is included within the full report. Domestic sales, as you can see on the chart on the left, show continued decline, and exports have not filled the gaps. Imports have been rising, albeit they've been rising slowly. Plant closures have therefore followed, and you'll see that on the right. So there was an idea, and the idea was expressed by the Commission, that the impact of tighter regulatory standards would be to drive innovation. And that innovation would help with the competitiveness of the industry, and that in turn would provide security for the many, many people who are employed by the sector. I think the simple conclusion from this slide here is that that's not happening. There will be many reasons for that, but it's not happening. And that's the context in which the new emissions targets will be thought through. Finally, because I don't want to keep you for too long, the chart on the left makes the point about the profitability of different areas of the world for automotive production. You'll see, perhaps not immediately, but you'll see that the EU has moved from being the most profitable region of global production in 2007 to a marginally loss-making region. Now, it can be said, and the Commission has said, that other manufacturers, all manufacturers selling into the EU, face similar constraints. And that's right. But because the constraints apply to new cars only, the effect is that emissions targets for the transport sector as a whole are being addressed by a focus on only new cars. And new cars represented 5% of the total car fleet in Europe in 2014. The effect of that is that the vehicle fleet, the car fleet in Europe has been aging. And of course, older cars produce more emissions than newer cars. So, if the effect of the mechanisms that are applied is to increase rather than decrease the overall age of the car fleet, they will be counterproductive. And that is why, as Mr. Ghosn has said, it is important that the issue is looked at not only from the perspective of the appropriate balance being struck, but also from the perspective of a comprehensive rather than intensely targeted framework of mechanisms to improve the emissions perspective for the transport sector in Europe. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much. Before we open up the floor for your questions, just to stress that this is an ACEA press conference. So Mr. Ghosn is speaking today in his capacity as President of ACEA. So while we welcome your industry-wide questions, we won't be taking company-specific ones. So before your question, if you could just say your name, your media, and questions in English, please.
Gilles Guillaume, Reuters. Is it too early to give us a clue on what the industry is ready to accept as the next target for CO2 emissions beyond 2021? Can you guide us to what is feasible, reachable, and unfeasible?
Yeah, well, first, let me tell you how it works, because you need to understand how the ACEA works. Today we are in the process of starting to talk about how we get to whatever objective will be set after 2020, and the discussion is mainly about what is the horizon. I mean, are we talking about objectives in 2030, or are we talking about objective in another horizon? That's what we're talking. We are absolutely not talking limit. But here, let me ask our chief cook, Mr. Eric Jannard, who is always into the different meetings in the with the European community, to tell you exactly where we are.
I'm not sure that my cooking talent is so extraordinary, but anyway, what you need to know, okay, first of all, that the Commission, when it comes to setting new targets for automotive, has officially said that they plan to come up with proposals only as from early 2016. Reason being that the current Commissioner in charge of climate change and energy, Commissioner Cañete, has been very clear that he wants to wait also for the outcome of the Global Climate Change Conference, end of this year in Paris, in order to make sure that we know what has been agreed first, before coming up with proposals. That's one. Second, you should know that the Commission already has set some targets for 2030. You may have heard that the Global Climate Change and Energy Package was already agreed at European level, which contains in fact the pledges of the EU for the Global Climate Change Conference. And it talks about reducing greenhouse gas emissions by by 2030, so 2030 is a target date that the Commission has set, reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% for ETS and by 30% for non-ETS sectors. It doesn't specify yet, the contribution of each of those non-ETS sectors, and automotive is a non-ETS sector, so it's not yet specified. So again, for the reasons I highlighted, the Commission is currently in a consultation process. And by the way, as Mr. Ghosn explained, next week, Thursday, there's a big stakeholder event that is organized in Brussels, organized by Commissioner Cañete, but where for the first time even, he has invited his two colleagues, Commissioner Bieńkowska, responsible for industry, and Commissioner Bulc, responsible for transport, to join forces with him and to engage in a consultation. It's going to hold a full day with workshops where NGOs, industry, all will be invited to make a contribution on their and give their perspective on what is possible, what they see as the opportunities as well as the challenges when it comes to delivering on the target. So on our side, that's why we, among others, have invested in the study which was presented to you, in order to ensure that the debate on setting these targets is balanced, and it can happen on the basis of real facts and figures. We are in the process of producing a series of studies, the first one you heard today, in order to make sure that when these targets will be proposed, they take into account economic realities and also take into account what is possible. Also take into account the learnings from what worked and didn't work in the past. So.
Any other questions? Okay, yes.
Yeah, Lawrence Frost, Reuters. You've identified the high CO2 abatement costs per vehicle and suggested that they can only increase with subsequent targets. Do you agree with those who've suggested recently that these costs, among others, could be better shared through consolidation? The views coming from Sergio Marchionne in particular, and did he leave alone today?
No, I don't think the ACEA discusses how the price of the new technology are going to be shared or passed. I don't think this kind of discussion takes place at the ACEA. What we can say that after the facts, we're saying that most of the cost of the new technology to limit emissions or to reduce CO2 are very difficult to pass on consumers. That's a constant. That's something that we observe after many years of developing technologies, putting them into the car, sell the cars. We come to the conclusion that each car manufacturer is facing the same difficulty, that the consumer obviously wants a more environmentally friendly cars, but doesn't want to pay for them in a certain way. It's a reality of the market. I mean, we can complain about it, but that's the reality of the market. So that's why, in fact, from one side, we know that the car is going to have to become much more efficient in terms of emission, but we are also facing the fact that we know that all the costs and the investments going into these emissions are just a cost of doing business. I mean, this will be absolutely no reward from the consumers about reaching these emissions, which is a tendency, which means a tendency of car manufacturer to exchange, collaborate, contract. You've seen many cases like this. We are just describing what's going on in the industry. Collaborate specifically on these technology. I don't think it implies something more than trying to collaborate together and trying to share together some pieces of technology, recognizing that this cost, not being able to be passed to the consumer, will have to be minimized. And the best way to minimize it is just to share some of these costs between suppliers, car manufacturers, and all people involved in the industry.
So, for example, in sharing more powertrains, there is another response to this, to bring down compliance costs per vehicle. There are other tools. that are available to the industry.
Oh, sure. I mean, there are other tools, but at the same time, this is a very competitive industry, and will continue to be very, very competitive. So I think what you're seeing today is all the collaboration that can take place is taking place within the boundaries of a very tough industry, which is competing in every segment and in every field.
So what you hear is the low-hanging fruit has been eaten up, and now, of course, the question is: the further you go down with targets, what is the limit? Because further, it's a bit like diving. Yeah? The lower you go, the more you get under pressure, and the question is, how far can you absorb that? How far can you take it? Because there's a cost aspect at the end of the day.
Here first.
Hi, David Jolly from the New York Times. You mentioned the problem with diesel, but only part of it, I think, because earlier in the spring here in Paris, we had air pollution levels that were the highest in the world, I believe, higher than Delhi or Beijing or Shanghai or anywhere. But you said that without, if they make any change to the incentives for diesel, then we're not going to make the targets that are in existence now. Is there a prospect then that clean diesel will really be clean if this fine particulate pollution is can be dealt with?
Yeah, well, I didn't say exactly what you mentioned. Probably I've not been very clear. What I'm saying is, first, modern diesel, particularly Euro 6, is not a car manufacturer initiative. This is a result of a decision made by the European community in collaboration with the ACEA. So at a certain point in time, there have been a decision about Euro 6, and this is a European decision. Okay? This decision implied massive investment from car manufacturers and imply significant cost per car. We know that we're talking about multi-hundred euros of overcost per car, depending on what car you're talking about, whether it's small or big, but it's a significant cost at the level of the car. So where we are today in terms of Euro 6, we just want to make sure that everybody understands that this is not a car manufacturer initiative. This is something which has been decided at the level of the European community after a very long discussion, implying a lot of investments and a lot of cost for the car industry. And the results in terms of emission today are the results which were targeted from the beginning in our discussion with the European community. Okay? So what I'm saying here is, at the moment where we have, as an industry, agreed with the European community on the targets, made the investments, obviously we have, it's not only about the car makers, it's also about the suppliers, made the investments, ordered the part, start to equip the cars, starting to see some kind of diesel bashing taking place in Europe is very preoccupying, because at the end of the day there is a very big confusion between the very old diesel engines which are still rolling on the roads. We mentioned the fact that a lot of them are 10 years plus older, and the new diesel, Euro 6, and putting everything in the same bag is just not fair to the efforts which have been done by the industry jointly with the European community in order to make the diesel clean. That's what we are saying. And what I'm saying is another fact which is very clear is, for whatever reason, and I don't believe it's going to happen because I always believe common sense prevails, if we can't reach the CO2 emission, the industry cannot reach the CO2 emission without the diesel technology. It's a fact. If for whatever reason today many cities in Europe says no diesel, well, there is no way we can reach the CO2 goals on which we as an industry committed. What we want is the objective to be given and in a certain way to leave us with the choice of technologies. What's the emission you want? What is the CO2? What is the CO2 level we want? And then let us choose. Do we want to do electric? Do we want to do clean diesel? Do we want to do hybrid? Do we want to do this or that? When we start to be involved into being selective about technology, then it becomes a little bit of a problem. That's what the industry is attracting the attention here about. We're just going to have to be consequent with decisions already made at the level of the European community.
Are you asking for some incentive for electrical cars in Europe? And
Are we
incentive for electrical cars? Do you think it will be the solution?
I think frankly, what you're talking about electric cars. Yeah. No, I think today, frankly, the reference in Europe, there are two particular countries which are doing a great job into seriously stimulating the electric cars. You have France in one way, and you have Norway from the other side. I mean, these are for us the two benchmarks in terms of what needs to be done to develop zero emission transportation. French government has recently taken very serious measures to promote electric car on top of what's being done to develop charging infrastructure, and we have seen for the last 3-4 months a real growth of the sales of the electric car, which means this is really resonating with the consumer. So we encourage more, in a certain way, more support for this new technology, particularly for the zero emission technology to come from different member states.
If I may add to that, that's in fact also an area where we think there's an opportunity for Europe to do better.
Yeah.
We have incentive schemes all over Europe today. All these incentive schemes are very different, and their impact on the market is also very different. So if we are really strong believers in an internal market for Europe, and we want to promote alternative fuel cars, it makes sense that car fleet renewal schemes or incentives get at least harmonized, or that there is, because that's always difficult in Europe when it comes to tax incentives, but at least that there would be exchange of best practices, that we learn from which country has the best scheme, what do we learn from it, what is the impact on the market, and how can we expand these best practices more systematically across Europe.
A question here at the front.
We're talking about, we're only talking about CO2 emissions, but what about the impact of nitrous oxides on the competitiveness of the automotive industry, and especially on diesel engines?
Yeah, well, I think when we talk about diesel is already much more efficient in terms of CO2. That's one of the big advantages of diesel compared to gasoline engine. Diesel was in the past had a disadvantage in terms of emissions. It has a big advantage in terms of CO2, it has a disadvantage in terms of emission. This is one of the reasons for which, particularly the latest regulation, moving from Euro 4, 5, 6, 6, was to eliminate the emissions, and NOx being a big part of this. And we came to a level with Euro 6, which is extremely efficient, and it's not only car manufacturers talking, we're talking about the European community here. We agreed with the European community on this, but this came at a very heavy cost, because this technology requires a lot of innovation and a lot of involvement from the suppliers. So today we are we think we are extremely efficient in terms of CO2 with the diesel, and also in terms of emission. We reached a level which anyway was the one which was targeted by the European community. But this came at a cost. So, but in Europe you can't sell cars unless you meet the emissions. So obviously, even you have a cost, everybody's going to be having the same cost. So it is a kind of leveled field, playing field. The problem we're facing here is because the consumer are just don't want to pay for those. They just don't want to pay for those. You see, I don't think any car manufacturer can today, after the fact, say, we were able to pass even a significant part of our cost to the consumer. It's just not happening. So it's part of the equation that we have to solve. I think there was a very interesting chart shown by Chris about the profitability of the industry. Europe has been zeroed. I mean, the car makers are making their money in North America and in the emerging markets. Well, if you continue on this trend, well, this has going to have very serious consequences on the industry. I don't think any industry can just continue to invest and hire and develop with zero return. And what you see here is that the profit of a car maker is not made only by selling cars. It's made by selling parts, it's made by financing the cars and selling any other elements. And even by adding all of this, what we're showing here is that in 2012, and why we stopped in 2012, because this was the latest data. I mean, you take 2013, I don't think it's much better. Probably 2014 is a little bit better because this is the first year of increase. But Europe profitability compared to North America or compared to China is just inexistent. And this is something which is an alarm signal about how about the future. But this is a translation, between other things, of the fact that you're adding up a lot of cost due to a lot of technology being introduced for the car, and the consumer is just not paying for it.
Are the costs to reduce nitrous oxide emission higher than to reduce CO2 emissions?
Well, it depends what you're talking about, but I think today, by definition, the diesel engines are more expensive than the gasoline engine, and that's one of the reasons for which you're seeing that, particularly in the more sensitive priced cars, the offer of gasoline engine is expanding, while the offer of a diesel engine is just receding, just because of the economic equation which is appearing to the car makers.
Yes, one last question.
Yeah, we just have time for one last question, so maybe just to check if anyone else has not.
Sorry, I just want
You have a question?
I had a question, but it's the same question than Gilles, but maybe I can just
Yes.
what's a realistic?
take the two.
Take the two, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What's a realistic target in terms of CO2 after 2020? Or yes, 80. A realistic target is 70 or?
But again, I mean, why would we end? I mean, it's too early, in my opinion, to kind of start doing a numbers game. Yeah? What we currently as industry are pleading for, that the current system and approach on tackling CO2 emissions from transport, that approach is being completely reconsidered. Okay? We don't think it's a fair system the way it's currently set up. Again, as you heard from the presentation from Mr. Osborne, CO2 emission targets are set upon manufacturers affecting only new vehicles, right? If you look at CO2 emissions outside there, 5% of those CO2 emissions come from new vehicles. 95% come from existing fleet. So even if we go for the most aggressive scenario, zero CO2 emissions for new vehicles, you don't resolve the problem. You're going to still have a lot of CO2 emissions. So there are other factors which need to be taken into account. And frankly, this has not been part of the debate today. So you need to look at the existing car fleet. You need to look at CO2 emissions from the use of the car. It's not because you have your car sitting in a parking lot that you will cause CO2 emissions. It's once you start driving. Then CO2 emissions will be influenced by the driver's style, will be influenced by the kind of roads on which you drive. There are a lot of factors. So issues like maintenance of the road infrastructure across Europe is a key element in there. Then you hear people saying, yeah, but you do all these efforts and CO2 emissions from transport, despite the fact that you are meeting the targets, these emissions go up all the time, contrary to what we see in other sectors. Why is that? But of course, transport emissions are related to the level of transport of goods and people. So if economy goes well and you transport more goods, of course there will be, in a way, an impact on emissions. If people move with their car for traveling and so on, of course, and more people take their car to go on vacation by car, it has an impact of emissions. So all these elements, I mean, you of course will not cause any emissions when you say to people stay at home.
Chris wanted the, yeah.
I just want to add one thing, which is that if the targets stay in their current form, then if they are too tight, they risk being counterproductive because people will buy fewer new cars, the older cars will remain in use for longer. And that's, from my perspective, the obvious risk in the way that targets are set. I suspect that it's much more important to change the nature of the targets than it is to tighten the level. Otherwise, the effects can be counterproductive.
Very
Very
simple
nice.
question. This one, do you have an updated forecast for 2015 ACEA passenger car sales for Europe?
What is our official forecast, Eric?
We said 2 to 3%.
Sorry, what was it?
We said for this calendar year, right? We officially announced 2 to 3%. 2 to 3%. Of course, you know, it all depends on different factors, but that was what we announced at the beginning of this year.
At the end of
There's no
April,
change in your forecast since the beginning of
at the end of April, as you know, the sales were up more than 6%.
but you haven't changed your...
Well, it takes some time to make a forecast, particularly not at the level of a car company, but at the level of an association, because you want to make sure that all car makers agree on it.
You said you're an optimist earlier.
No, I'm just telling you the figures. We have an official forecast from ACEA at 3%, but the sales at the end of April are 6% plus. That's it. But we didn't redo the forecast of the ACEA.
We didn't. Yeah.
We didn't redo.
Okay, thank you very much. I understand Mr. Ghosn has to leave for a meeting. If anyone has further questions for Mr. Osborne and Mr. Leonard, they have a few minutes. And please take a copy of our press release if you haven't got it, and the speech, my colleague Irina outside has a copy of that, Mr. Ghosn's speech as well.
Thank you.